Exiled at 12 for lying about the ice fog, she built a steam hut. Gustav Thorsen, who had survived 9 Montana winters, told her plainly, "You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you. That's arithmetic." She had $3, 2 siblings, and needed 8 cords of firewood she could not cut. On November 12, 1887, the temperature dropped 65 degrees in 3 days. But 5 months earlier, Elsa Morenius had never felt the earth breathe steam beneath her feet. In August of 1887, Elsa stood at the edge of her father's grave and counted what remained. 3 silver dollars pressed flat in her palm, a sod cabin with gaps in the chinking wide enough to fit her fingers through, 40 pounds of flour, a rusted axe with a loose head, and 2 children younger than herself who stared at her with the same pale blue eyes their father had closed 3 weeks before. The Morenius claim sat 11 miles southeast of Gardner, Montana Territory on a bench of land overlooking the Yellowstone River. Her father, Christopher, had filed on the quarter section in the spring of 1886, believing, like hundreds of other Norwegian immigrants, that cattle ranching in Montana Territory was the path to American prosperity. Then came the winter they would later call the Great Die-Up. 16 inches of snow fell in 16 hours that January. Temperatures plunged to 46 degrees below zero. Across Montana, 362,000 cattle froze where they stood, their bodies preserved like statues until spring revealed the scale of the devastation. Christopher Morenius lost every animal he owned. He spent the following year trying to rebuild with money he didn't have, taking odd jobs in Gardner when he could find them, falling further behind on every payment, eating less so the children could eat more. By summer of '87, his cough had turned bloody. By August, his children were orphans. Elsa was 12 years old. Her brother Anders was 9. Her sister Marta was 6. The nearest town was Gardner, a collection of ramshackle buildings that locals called Shantyville, an ideal squatter town with the rudest houses in the territory. The railroad terminus at Cinnabar sat 8 miles north. Fort Yellowstone, where the cavalry administered the new national park, lay 5 miles south at Mammoth Hot Springs. None of these places wanted 3 Norwegian orphans with no money and no relatives. On the 3rd day after the burial, Gustav Thorsen rode up to the cabin. Thorsen owned the largest remaining spread in the valley, 400 head of cattle, 3 hired hands, a 2-story frame house with actual glass windows. He had survived 9 Montana winters, including the die-up, through methods he explained to anyone who would listen. Sufficient firewood, properly banked walls, livestock sheltered in sturdy barns, and the good sense God gave a turnip. He wore a fox fur coat even in August and smelled of tobacco and something Elsa couldn't name. He did not dismount from his horse. "Heard about your father," Thorsen said, looking past Elsa to where Anders and Marta watched from the cabin doorway. "Shame. He wasn't built for this country, but he tried harder than most." Elsa said nothing. She had learned that men like Thorsen asked questions by making statements. If you answered the statements, you gave them power. If you waited, sometimes they revealed themselves. Thorsen shifted in his saddle. "A 12-year-old girl can't run a claim. Winter's 5 months away, and you don't have the timber cut, don't have the stores laid, don't have the chinking done." He gestured at the cabin. "Those gaps will let in cold that'll freeze a water barrel solid in 2 hours. You know how cold it gets here?" "I know. Do you?" Thorsen's voice carried no cruelty, only the certainty of a man who had watched people die from optimism. 40 below in January, sometimes 50 below. Wind comes down the valley like a blade. Last winter, I found 2 of my hands frozen dead between the bunkhouse and the barn. That's 30 feet, and they couldn't make it. He pulled his coat tighter. A woman alone can't cut enough timber to survive here. You're not a woman. You're a child. And those, he nodded toward Anders and Marta, are smaller children. You'll freeze, and they'll freeze with you. That's not a prediction. That's arithmetic. Elsa felt the weight of the $3 in her pocket. She thought about the rusted axe with the loose head. What do you suggest? She asked. Orphan train comes through Livingston every 6 weeks, Torsen said. I'll give you enough for 3 tickets and enough to eat on the journey. You'll end up somewhere in the East, Minnesota, Iowa, maybe Illinois. Farm families take children in. You'd have a roof, food, a future. Better than dying of pride on a dirt claim your father couldn't make work. Anders and Marta had crept closer. Marta's hand found Elsa's and squeezed. The claim is ours, Elsa said. Father filed the papers. We have 5 years to prove up. You have 5 months until the temperature drops, Torsen said. You can't prove up if you're dead. He reached into his saddlebag and produced a small leather pouch. Coins clinked inside. $12. Enough for tickets and food. I'll buy the claim for another $50 after you leave. That's generous, considering what it's worth, and you 3 can start over somewhere that doesn't kill children. Elsa looked at the pouch. $12 would buy flour for 3 months, or seed for spring planting, or nails to fix the chinking, and boards to patch the roof, and glass for a window that didn't leak cold. $12 could also buy 3 tickets on a train heading east toward cities where the air tasted like coal smoke, and you couldn't see the stars at night, and children worked in factories until their fingers bled. No, Elsa said. Torsen's expression didn't change. He put the pouch back in his saddlebag. The cold doesn't negotiate, he said. It doesn't care about courage or stubbornness or how much you loved your father. It just kills. He turned his horse. When the children get sick, and they will get sick, when you're burning the furniture because you don't have enough wood, when the flour runs out and the walls are white with frost and you can see your breath inside the cabin at noon, you'll remember this conversation, and by then it'll be too late. He rode away without looking back. Elsa watched him until he disappeared over the ridge. Then she turned to her siblings. Anders was trying to look brave and failing. Marta was crying silently, the way she had learned to cry in the week since their mother died in childbirth and their father started coughing blood. We're not leaving, Elsa said. This is our land. Father died for it. We're not leaving. She didn't know how they would survive, but she knew the train heading east was a different kind of death, slower, quieter, and just as permanent. That night, she did the arithmetic Torsen had mentioned. 8 cords of firewood minimum for a Montana winter. At her pace with the rusted axe, she could cut and split perhaps a quarter cord per day if she worked from dawn until dark. 32 days of work. But she also had to repair the cabin, lay in food stores, tend the small garden that provided their vegetables, watch her siblings, cook meals, haul water, and perform the 1,000 other tasks that survival demanded. She had 5 months. She needed 12. The numbers didn't work. Torsen was right about the arithmetic, but Torsen didn't know about the old man who lived in the cave near the hot springs. Elsa had met Crowbird in the spring of '86, before the die-up destroyed her family. She had been gathering firewood near the hot springs at the boundary of the park when she stumbled onto his camp, a shallow cave in the travertine where steam vented from cracks in the rock. He was Tukudika, one of the sheep-eaters, mountain Shoshone who had lived in the Yellowstone country for generations before the soldiers came. His people had been rounded up 7 years earlier and marched to the Fort Hall Reservation in Idaho, but Crowbird had slipped away. He was too old to survive the journey, he said. Better to die in the land of the burning ground than in some flat place where the earth didn't breathe. Elsa's father had forbidden her from speaking to Indians, but Christopher Morenius had been in Gardner that day, and Elsa was 12 years old and curious and tired of rules that seemed to exist only because adults were afraid. Crowbird was missing 3 fingers on his left hand. Frostbite, he said, from a winter before her grandmother was born. His face was the color of old leather, creased with so many lines that his eyes nearly disappeared when he smiled. He spoke English haltingly, mixed with Shoshone words Elsa didn't understand, and he laughed at things that weren't funny and asked questions she didn't know how to answer. That first meeting lasted an hour. Elsa came back the following week, and the week after that. By summer of '86, she'd learned things no other white child in Montana Territory knew. She learned that the Tucutica moved to the hot springs basins every winter, camping where steam vented from the earth, where the ground stayed warm enough to melt snow and the air carried heat even when the world froze solid. She learned that they soaked bighorn sheep horns in the hot springs to soften them, then bent the horns into boughs worth more than a horse. She learned that the earth here was alive, that fire burned beneath the surface, and if you knew where to look, you could find places where the ground breathed warmth like a sleeping animal. She learned about the ice fog. Crowbird called it by a Shoshone word she couldn't pronounce, something that sounded like pogonip when he said it slowly for her benefit. White fog, he said, fog that isn't water anymore, fog made of ice itself. When the temperature dropped below a point so cold that water turned to crystals in the air, the ice fog came. It was beautiful, he said, diamond dust falling from a clear sky, light pillars rising from every flame. It was also death. The ice fog came only during the worst cold, Crowbird explained, 40 below, 50 below. And there were signs before it arrived. When warm water met very cold air, like the hot springs meeting an approaching cold front, mist would rise and then crystallize as it lifted. If you saw strange white mist rising from any warm water source just before the pressure dropped, you had hours, maybe less. The mist tells you, Crowbird said, if you listen. Elsa had filed this information alongside all the other things Crowbird taught her, useful knowledge she might never need. Then her mother died, and her father started coughing, and she stopped visiting the cave because there were always chores to do, always mouths to feed, always another crisis demanding her attention. When she finally took the feather, because it was all she took the feather, because it was all she had left of him, and she didn't know if he had died or moved on or been captured by the cavalry patrols. But she remembered what he had taught her. On the 14th of September, she saw the mist. It rose from the Yellowstone River at dawn, not ordinary fog, but something heavier, stranger, catching the early light in ways that made it sparkle like ground glass. The river was warmer than the air above it, and where the two met, the water vapor crystallized instantly into tiny floating ice crystals. Elsa had seen fog before. This was different. This was the mist Crowbird had described. She ran to Gardner. The town was waking up when she arrived, men heading to work in the sawmill, women drawing water from the communal well, children chasing chickens in the muddy streets. Elsa grabbed the first person she saw, a miner named Henrik Lund, who worked claims near Cook City, and told him the ice fog was coming, that the mist from the river meant the temperature was about to drop, that they had to prepare. Lund laughed. It's September, girl. The cold won't come for another month at least. And who told you this nonsense about fog predicting weather? She couldn't say Crowbird's name. Indians were forbidden in the park and in Gardner. Anyone who helped them face fines or worse. I learned it, she said. The mist means cold, bad cold, coming fast. Lund patted her head like she was a dog. You've had a hard summer, losing your father and all, but imagining disasters won't bring him back. Go home, tend your siblings, and leave weather prediction to the Signal Corps. Elsa tried 2 more people, Mrs. Bergstrom at the general store and the blacksmith, whose name she never learned, with the same result. Smiles, head pats, dismissal. By noon, word had spread through Gardner that the Marenius orphan was spinning stories. By evening, the stories had become lies. By the next morning, she was a liar. It was Martha Crenshaw who said it first, or at least said it loudest. Martha ran the boarding house where several of the married cavalry officers lived, and her voice carried through Gardner like a foghorn. That Norwegian girl is telling everyone the world's about to end. Ice fog this, freeze that. She's lying to get attention because she's terrified no one will help her and those children through the winter. It's pathetic, really. Someone should do something before she panics the whole town. The something they did was simple. They stopped talking to her. When Elsa went to the general store to spend one of her $3 on salt and candles, Mrs. Bergstrom looked through her as if she were made of glass. When she asked the blacksmith about sharpening the axe, he said he was too busy and would be too busy for the foreseeable future. When she walked down Gardner's main street, conversation stopped and resumed only after she passed. She had told the truth and been named a liar. She had tried to warn them and been cast out. Gustav Thorsen found her on the road back to her cabin. "Heard you made quite a scene in town," he said. His fox fur coat was open in the mild September air, and he smelled like tobacco again. Ice fog, temperature drops, the end of days. He shook his head. "You've made yourself a pariah, girl. No one will help you now. No one will extend credit or lend tools or share labor when the hard times come. You've isolated yourself and those children completely." He rode closer until his horse was nearly touching her shoulder. "The offer still stands," Thorsen said. $12 for the train. Better to be poor in Iowa than dead and forgotten in Montana, because that's what you'll be now. Dead and forgotten. The cold will kill you, and everyone will say you had it coming for lying about the fog. Elsa looked up at him. "I wasn't lying." "It doesn't matter," Thorsen said. "They think you were. And in this country, what people think is the only thing that matters." He turned his horse. "Good luck, Miss Marenius. You'll need it." She watched him ride away, and something hardened in her chest. Not anger exactly. Anger required energy she couldn't spare. Something colder, determination maybe, or spite. They would not help her. They believed she was a liar. The arithmetic still didn't work, so she would have to find a different kind of arithmetic. The steam vent was 3 miles from her cabin, in a ravine that cut through the foothills toward Mammoth Hot Springs. Elsa found it by accident, following a deer trail in search of game, when the ground beneath her feet suddenly felt warm through her worn boots. She stopped, knelt, pressed her palm flat against the earth. The rock was hot. Not burning, not dangerous, but warm enough that she jerked her hand back in surprise. Steam rose from a crack in the stone where the ravine wall met the valley floor. The steam smelled faintly of sulfur, but nothing like the sharp, choking reek near some of the park's more active features. This was mild, almost pleasant. She thought of Crowbird. She thought of what he had told her about the Tukutika, about wintering near the vents where the earth breathed warmth. She thought about the cabin 11 miles away, with its gaps in the chinking and its rusted stove and its 8 cords of wood that she couldn't possibly cut in time. And then she thought of something Crowbird had never mentioned, because he would never have needed to build it. The Tukudika moved with the seasons. They didn't need permanent shelter over the vents because they carried their shelter with them. But what if someone did build over a vent? What if instead of warming yourself beside the steam, you channeled the steam beneath a floor, let it heat stones and clay, let the earth's warmth rise into a structure while the Montana winter raged outside? The idea formed slowly, like ice crystals gathering in cold air, a shelter over the vent, channels dug into the ground to carry the steam, flat stones laid over the channels, sealed with clay, a floor that stayed warm without firewood, without fuel, without labor beyond the initial construction. It was insane. It was impossible. It contradicted everything the settlers of Gardner knew about survival. It might also work. Elsa spent 3 days studying the vent. She measured the steam's temperature by timing how long she could hold her hand over the crack, roughly as hot as water just before boiling, she estimated. She traced the fissure 20 feet along the ravine wall, noting where the steam emerged strongest and where it faded to mere warmth. She dug exploratory trenches with a stick, testing the soil depth before hitting rock. On the 4th day, she brought Anders and Marta to see. "This is where we're going to live," she told them. "This is how we're going to survive the winter." Anders frowned. He was old enough to understand that they were supposed to live in their father's cabin, supposed to cut firewood and bank the walls and do all the things normal settlers did. "The cabin is 11 miles away," he said. "All our things are there. We'll bring what we need." "What about the claim? We have to live on the claim to prove up." "The claim will still be there in spring," Elsa said. "We won't be if we try to winter in that cabin." Marta said nothing. She was 6 years old and had stopped speaking 3 weeks ago, somewhere between their father's burial and Elsa's exile from Gardner. The doctor, if Gardner had a doctor, which it didn't, would have called it shock. Elsa called it fear that had gone so deep it couldn't find its way out anymore. She knelt in front of her sister. "Marta, do you feel how warm the ground is?" Marta nodded. "The earth is warm here because there's fire far below, like a stove that never goes out. If we build a house over this warm place and let the heat come up through the floor, we'll be warm all winter, no matter how cold it gets, no matter how much snow falls. Warm." Marta's eyes flickered, the first sign of something other than blankness that Elsa had seen in weeks. "Do you trust me?" Marta nodded again. "Then help me. We're going to dig." The construction began on September 20th. Elsa estimated she had roughly 60 days until the worst cold arrived, maybe more, maybe less, depending on when the temperature decided to drop. She had no proper tools beyond the axe, a broken shovel she'd salvaged from behind the Gardner livery stable, and rocks she shaped into crude implements by hammering them against harder rocks. The first task was the channel system. She dug trenches 18 inches deep and 12 inches wide, starting at the main steam vent and running parallel across what would become the floor space. The soil here was loose, volcanic ash, and decomposed rock rather than the dense clay of the valley floor, which made digging easier, but also meant the walls of her trenches kept collapsing. She solved this by lining the channels with flat stones, fitted together like puzzle pieces and packed with mud at the joints. The work was slow. Each stone had to be collected from the ravine bottom, carried to the site, tested for fit, adjusted, replaced if it didn't work. Elsa's hands blistered on the first day. The blisters broke on the second day. By the end of the first week, her palms were masses of raw flesh that she wrapped in strips torn from her only spare dress. Anders helped with the lighter stones. Marta helped by sorting rocks into piles, flat ones for the channel walls, larger flat ones for the channel covers, round ones that were useless, but which she arranged in neat rows because arranging things gave her something to do besides remember. On September 27th, Ingrid Halverson came to watch. Ingrid owned a small vegetable plot north of Gardner, where she grew carrots and turnips and potatoes, and sold them to the cavalry at Fort Yellowstone. She was 53 years old, a widow like half the women in Montana Territory, and possessed a face that suggested she had seen everything and was no longer impressed by any of it. She stood at the edge of the ravine for 10 minutes, watching Elsa fit stones into a channel, before she spoke. "They say you're building a tomb for yourself." Elsa didn't look up. "They say a lot of things. They say you're channeling steam from the devil's kitchen into some kind of witch hut." "The devil doesn't have a kitchen here, just hot water and rock." Ingrid descended into the ravine, moving carefully on the loose soil. She examined the channel system, the piles of stones, the 3 children working in near silence. "What are you actually doing?" Elsa explained. "The steam vent, the channels, the principle of heated floors that the Tukudika understood, that farmers in places she'd never heard of had used for thousands of years. The idea that you could let the earth warm you if you were smart enough to listen to it." Ingrid listened without interrupting. When Elsa finished, she asked one question. "Will it work?" "I don't know," Elsa admitted, "but I know the cabin won't work. Not for 3 children without enough wood or enough food or enough help. This might fail. The cabin will definitely fail." Ingrid studied the steam rising from the fissure. She pressed her hand against a stone Elsa had placed over a completed section of channel. The stone was warm. "The logic isn't insane," Ingrid said slowly. "Soapstone retains heat. That's why they use it for foot warmers on trains. Steam transfers heat to stone. Stone releases heat slowly into the room above." She shook her head. "But there's no precedent. No one's done this before. What if the steam changes? What if the fissure shifts? What if poison gas seeps up through your floor?" "Then we'll die," Elsa said. "But we'll die warm." Ingrid barked a laugh that contained no humor. "The girl has a sense of irony. Good. You'll need it." She climbed out of the ravine. "I'll tell you what. I have turnips coming ripe in 2 weeks. More than I can sell. If you're still working here when the turnips are ready, if you haven't given up, haven't frozen, haven't poisoned yourself with devil's steam, I'll bring you a bushel. Not charity. Trade. I want to see how this turns out. That's worth a bushel of turnips. And if it doesn't work, then I'll have wasted some turnips, and you'll be dead." Ingrid shrugged. "I've wasted turnips on worse bets." She walked away without saying goodbye. Elsa returned to her stones. October arrived with frost on the ground every morning. The days were still warm enough, 50s, sometimes 60s, but the nights dropped into the 20s, and every dawn brought white crystals on the grass that vanished as the sun rose. The channel system was complete. 20 feet of stone-lined trenches, 3 parallel runs connected at the upstream end to the main steam vent and vented at the downstream end to open air through a crude chimney of stacked rocks. Steam flowed through the channels constantly, heating the stones and escaping through the vent in thin white wisps. Now came the harder part, covering the channels. Elsa needed flat stones large enough to span the 12-inch width without falling through, and thick enough to hold heat without cracking. She spent days searching the ravine and the surrounding hillsides, collecting every suitable stone she could find, carrying them one by one back to the site. The largest stones weighed more than she did. She learned to lever them onto makeshift sledges of pine branches and drag them rather than lift. By October 10th, she had covered half the floor space. By October 15th, her body had begun to fail. The weight loss was visible first. Her dress hung loose where it had fit snugly in August. Her cheekbones jutted. Her wrists looked like bundles of sticks wrapped in skin. She was eating half of what the children ate, claiming she wasn't hungry, hiding her portions in her pocket to give to Marta later, and working twice as hard. And the arithmetic of calories was as brutal as the arithmetic of firewood. The exhaustion came next. She fell asleep in the middle of the day, waking to find Anders shaking her shoulder with tears on his face. She dropped stones she should have been able to lift. She lost her balance on flat ground, stumbling like a drunk. Her hands wouldn't stop bleeding. The constant abrasion of rough stone against raw palms had opened wounds that couldn't heal because she never stopped working. She wrapped them in bark now, the inner bark of birch that was slightly antiseptic, but the blood soaked through within hours. On October 18th, she collapsed in the ravine and couldn't get up. Anders found her face down in the dirt, half conscious, mumbling about stones and channels and warmth. He couldn't lift her. She still weighed more than he did, even starved, so he covered her with his jacket and ran 3 miles to Gardner for help. No one would come. He went to the general store, to the blacksmith, to the boarding house. He told them his sister had collapsed, that she needed help, that she might be dying. Mrs. Bergstrom looked away. The blacksmith was too busy. Martha Crenshaw said, "Your sister chose this. She lied to everyone, and now she's paying for it. That's not our concern." Anders returned to the ravine alone. Elsa was still lying where he'd left her, but her eyes were open now, staring at the sky. "No one would help," he said. "I know." "Why? What did you do?" Elsa closed her eyes. "I told them the truth. They didn't want to hear it." She forced herself to stand. Her vision grayed at the edges. Her legs shook so badly she could barely walk. But she stood. "We're not done," she said. "We can't be done." That night, while the children slept in the corner of the partially completed structure, Elsa allowed herself 5 minutes of despair. 5 minutes to acknowledge that she was probably going to die, that her siblings were probably going to die, that all her planning and labor and determination meant nothing against the simple reality that a 12-year-old body couldn't work like an adult's without consequences. Then she wiped her face and began calculating how much remained. The floor needed another 4 days of work. The walls needed at least 2 weeks. Log construction that she would have to do with an axe and no help and hands that were already destroyed. The roof needed time she didn't have, materials she couldn't afford, skills she hadn't learned. It was October 18th. Winter would arrive by Thanksgiving at the latest. She had perhaps 5 weeks. She needed 10. The arithmetic still didn't work. Ingrid Halvorsen arrived on October 20th with a bushel of turnips and an expression Elsa couldn't read. "You're still alive," Ingrid said. "I owe you turnips." She set the bushel on the completed portion of the floor, where steam rose gently through gaps between the stones. She pressed her hand against the stone surface, held it there, and raised her eyebrows. "Warm," she said. "Genuinely warm." "The channels work," Elsa said. "The stones hold heat. When the cover is complete, the whole floor will be warm enough to—" "Stop." Ingrid held up a hand. "I have eyes. I can see it works." She looked at Elsa, at the visible ribs, the bloody bandages on her hands, the gray pallor of exhaustion. "I can also see you're dying. That won't do. If you die before winter, I won't get to see if this ridiculous idea actually survives the cold." "I'm not." "You are. I've seen starvation. I nursed my husband through it before the end. You have maybe 3 weeks before your body starts eating itself. Less if you keep working at this pace." Ingrid crossed her arms. "So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to help you. Not because I like you. I don't know you well enough to like you. But because I'm old enough to be curious about things and young enough to still take risks. This is interesting. I want to see how it ends." Elsa opened her mouth to object, but Ingrid cut her off. "Don't argue. You don't have the energy. Just tell me what needs doing and let's do it before you collapse again." The help changed everything. Ingrid was 53, not 20, but she had 30 years of Montana experience that Elsa lacked. She knew how to notch logs for stable walls, how to mix mud and grass into chinking that actually held, how to build a roof that would shed snow instead of collapsing under its weight. She worked slowly but steadily, and she brought food, Real food, not just turnips, but salt pork and dried beans and flour that was fresh instead of weevil infested. She also brought news from Gardner. "They're taking bets," Ingrid said one evening as they placed the final floor stones over the channel system. "On when you'll freeze, on when the steam will poison you, on when you'll come crawling back to town begging for the train tickets Torsen offered." She snorted. "I put $5 on you surviving the winter. Best odds I could get." "You bet on me." "I bet on the physics. The physics make sense. Whether your body holds out is another question." By November 1st, the floor was complete. 120 square feet of heated stone, warm to the touch even as the morning temperature dropped into the teens. The walls were halfway up. The roof existed only in Elsa's imagination. On November 5th, the temperature dropped to 0. On November 8th, it dropped to 15 below. On November 10th, Elsa looked at the sky at dawn and saw something she recognized. Mist was rising from the Yellowstone River. Not ordinary fog. The strange, crystalline mist that sparkled in the early light like ground glass. She had seen it before, on September 14th, the day she had warned Gardner, the day they had called her a liar. The ice fog was coming, and this time she didn't have a cabin with a leaky roof and gaps in the chinking. She had an unfinished shelter with no roof at all, 2 children who trusted her, and exactly one chance to get this right. "Ingrid," she said, "how fast can you build a roof?" Ingrid looked at the mist rising from the river. She looked at the roofless walls. She looked at Elsa's face. "Fast," she said. "We'd better work fast." They built the roof in 2 days. It wasn't a proper roof, not the kind you'd see on a cabin in Gardner with its milled lumber and tar paper and iron nails. This was desperation made structural. Pine poles laid across the walls, branches woven between them, a thick layer of sod cut from the hillside and stacked 6 inches deep on top. Ingrid worked without speaking, her breath coming in white clouds as the temperature continued to drop. Elsa handed up materials until her arms gave out, then used her body as a brace while Ingrid positioned the heavier poles. Anders and Marta stayed inside the unfinished shelter, sitting on the warm stone floor, while frost crept across everything else. The contrast was stark, ice forming on the wall logs while the children sat without shivering, heat rising from the channels beneath them. By the evening of November 11th, the roof was done. Not beautiful, not permanent, but done. The temperature was 22 below 0. Elsa sealed the gaps between the roof and walls with mud that froze as she applied it, then thawed from the inside as the steam-warmed air rose. The door was a frame of branches covered with 2 elk hides that Ingrid had brought from her cabin. "I was saving them for something," she said, "and I suppose this counts." A small opening in the roof served as a vent, letting the steam-laden air escape while drawing fresh air through gaps around the door frame. Inside, the shelter was warm, not just survivable. Warm. Elsa pressed her palm against the floor and felt heat radiating upward, steady and constant, the earth's own fire channeled through stone and clay into the space where her siblings sat. She had no thermometer, but the sensation was unmistakable, the same warmth as her father's cabin in October, before the cold came, before the stove burned through their carefully rationed wood. "It works," Anders said. He sounded surprised, which hurt Elsa in a small, tired way. Even her brother hadn't quite believed. "It works so far," Ingrid corrected. "Nothing. Wait until it drops to 40 nothing. Wait until it drops to 40 below. Wait until the wind comes." "It will hold." "You don't know that." "No," Elsa admitted. "But I built it to hold. The channels run the full length of the floor. The stones retain heat for hours even if the steam stops. The walls are 6 inches of solid pine. It will hold. Ingrid grunted, neither agreement nor disagreement. I'm going back to Gardner. My own cabin needs tending, and I've been away too long. She pulled on her coat, wrapping a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed. If this works, if you're still alive when the worst passes, you send word. I want to know. And if it doesn't work, then I'll know anyway. Ingrid paused at the door. For what it's worth, I think you might survive, not because you deserve to. I don't believe in deserving, but because the physics is sound. Good luck, Elsa Morenius. She disappeared into the darkness. The temperature was still dropping. Elsa fed her siblings the last of the salt pork Ingrid had brought, then wrapped them in every blanket they owned and settled them onto the warm floor near the center of the shelter. The stones radiated heat like a living thing, and within minutes both children were asleep. She stayed awake, watching the steam rise through the gaps in the floor, listening to the wind beginning to build outside, counting her resources, half a bushel of turnips, a quarter bag of flour, a handful of dried beans, maybe a week of food, maybe less. The shelter was warm, but warmth alone wouldn't save them. She thought about Gardner, 11 miles away. The people who had called her a liar, the people who had refused to help Anders when she collapsed, Martha Crenshaw and her foghorn voice, Gustav Thorsen and his fox fur coat. They didn't know the ice fog was coming. They thought this cold snap was ordinary, bad, certainly, but ordinary. They had no idea what was building behind the clouds. Elsa could have warned them again, could have walked to town and told them what the mist on the river meant, what Crow Bird had taught her, what was about to descend on Montana territory like the hand of God closing into a fist. She stayed in her shelter. She was done warning people who wouldn't listen. November 12th dawned gray and still. The temperature at first light was 31 below zero. Elsa knew because Ingrid had left a mercury thermometer, a gift, she said, because she wanted accurate data about whether the shelter worked. The mercury had retreated into a tight silver ball at the bottom of the glass. Inside the shelter, the floor was warm. The air was warm. The children slept peacefully, unaware that the world outside had become deadly. Then the wind arrived. It came from the northwest, howling down the Yellowstone Valley like something alive and angry. Elsa had experienced Montana wind before, the endless, grinding wind that never stopped, that drove settlers mad, that found every crack and gap and exploited them without mercy. This was different. This wind didn't blow. It attacked. The shelter shook. Sod shifted on the roof. Gaps in the chinking that had been invisible suddenly became channels for cold air that cut like knives. Elsa felt the temperature inside the shelter drop, still warm but falling, as the wind stole heat faster than the floor could replace it. She stuffed the gaps with strips of blanket, with handfuls of dried grass, with anything she could find. The children woke and stared at her with wide eyes as the wind screamed and the walls groaned, and the world outside disappeared into white. By noon, Elsa couldn't see her hand in front of her face when she opened the door. The ice fog had come. Not fog as she understood it. Not the gray mist of morning that burned off by afternoon. This was different. This was white, so dense it seemed solid, pressing against the shelter like something trying to get in. Tiny ice crystals filled the air, glittering where the light from the door touched them, swirling in patterns that made her eyes hurt. The snow that fell wasn't snow anymore. It was powder so fine it moved like smoke, sliding through gaps a cat entirely into the bulb. Below the lowest, entirely into the bulb, below the lowest marking, below anything the instrument could measure. 40 below? 50 below? She had no way to know. What she knew was this: nothing could survive outside. not livestock, not wildlife, not humans. The cold had become absolute, and anything caught in it would freeze in minutes. She sealed the door with every scrap of material she could find and returned to her siblings. The floor was still warm. The channels still flowed with steam, but the walls were white with frost now, ice forming on the inside surface as the warmth from below met the killing cold from without. "Elsa?" Anders's voice was small. "Are we going to die?" She looked at her brother, at Marta, who had pressed herself against the warm stones and was watching with eyes that held something other than blankness for the first time in months. "No," Elsa said. "We're going to stay here on the warm floor, and we're going to wait. The floor doesn't need wood. It doesn't need fuel. It just needs the earth, and the earth doesn't get tired." She pulled both children close, arranging them on the warmest section of floor, covering them with blankets, making herself a wall between them and the frozen walls. The wind screamed. The temperature fell. The ice fog pressed against the shelter like something hungry, and the floor stayed warm. The second night was the worst. Elsa had stopped checking the thermometer because it couldn't tell her anything useful anymore. The cold had become a physical presence, seeping through every gap, coating every surface with ice, turning the air inside the shelter into something that hurt to breathe. She could see her breath crystallizing before it left her mouth, tiny ice particles that sparkled in the dim light before settling on the blankets. The children slept, or pretended to sleep, curled together on the warmest stones. Elsa didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the wind change pitch, and her heart clenched with the certainty that the roof was failing, the walls were collapsing, the channels were freezing solid. None of those things happened. The roof held. The walls held. The channels continued to breathe steam up through the floor, a steady warmth that pushed back against the impossible cold. But the food was running out. They had eaten the last of the turnips that morning. The flour was gone. The beans were gone. What remained was a 1/4 pound of salt, useless without food to season, and snow they could melt for water. Elsa calculated they could survive 3 days without food, maybe 4, before hunger became dangerous. The storm showed no sign of stopping. On the morning of November 14th, Marta spoke. "Elsa." Her voice was hoarse from weeks of silence. "Someone is outside." Elsa thought she was dreaming. No one could be outside. Outside was death. Outside was 50 below zero with wind that stripped heat from flesh in seconds. No one. The pounding on the door was real. Elsa stared at the elk-hide covering, watching it shake with each blow. Someone was out there. Someone had found them in the ice fog, in the white death, in conditions that should have made navigation impossible. She pulled back the hide and saw Gustav Thorsen. He was covered in ice. His fox fur coat was white with frost, his beard a solid mass of frozen condensation, his eyes the only living thing in a face that had become a mask of cold. Behind him, barely visible in the swirling white, were shapes, people, huddled together, holding on to each other to avoid becoming separated in the fog. "You were right," Thorsen said. His voice was a croak. "You were right about the fog." Elsa should have felt triumph. She felt nothing but the cold rushing past Thorsen into her shelter, stealing the warmth her floor had fought all night to build. "Inside," she said. "Get inside, now." Thorsen stumbled through the door. Behind him came others, Henrik Lund, the miner who had laughed at her, Mrs. Bergstrom from the general store, 2 cavalry soldiers from Fort Yellowstone, their blue uniforms hidden under every piece of clothing they owned, a woman Elsa didn't recognize, carrying a child who wasn't moving, 7 people, 8, counting the child. They crowded into the shelter, into the space Elsa had built for three, and the temperature dropped as their frozen bodies absorbed heat from the air. But the floor held. The floor stayed warm, and one by one, as they pressed their frozen hands against the heated stones, they stopped shivering. The Crenshaw boarding house collapsed, Torsen said. He was sitting on the floor now, his coat off, his hands pressed flat against stones that radiated warmth he couldn't understand. Snow load on the roof, 3 people inside, 2 got out, 1 didn't. Martha Crenshaw, the woman who had called Elsa a liar, the woman who had turned the town against her. Elsa felt something twist in her chest, not satisfaction, something colder. The stables burned, Henrik Lund added. He was weeping, not from grief, but from the pain of circulation returning to frozen fingers. Someone tried to warm the horses with a fire. Wind caught it. Whole building went up. 20 horses dead. More cattle frozen in the fields. Everything's dying out there. The woman with the child made a sound, a moan that wasn't quite words. Elsa looked at the bundle in her arms and saw a boy of perhaps 4, his lips blue, his eyes closed, his skin the color of tallow. "He won't wake up," the woman said. "He was fine when we left, and then the wind came, and now he won't wake up." Elsa pushed through the crowded shelter to the woman's side. She touched the boy's forehead, cold, so cold, and his chest still moving, barely. Alive but freezing from the inside out. "Put him on the floor," Elsa said. "On the stones, the warmest spot near the main channel." The woman hesitated. "The floor?" "The floor's heated, steam from underground. Put him down." The woman laid her son on the stones. Elsa stripped off his frozen coat, his frozen mittens, pressed his small body directly against the warm surface. The boy didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, irregular. "We need to warm him slowly," Elsa said. She had no idea if this was true. She was 12 years old and had never treated hypothermia before, but she remembered something Crowbird had told her about frozen hands, about how warming them too fast caused pain and damage. "Cover him with blankets, but leave his chest on the stones. Let the heat come up through him." The mother did as she was told. The shelter was silent except for the wind outside and the labored breathing of a child who might already be dying. Anders appeared at Elsa's elbow. "There's no food," he whispered. "How are we going to feed everyone?" Elsa looked at the crowded shelter. 11 people now, counting herself and her siblings. Half a pound of salt, no flour, no beans, no turnips. The storm still raging outside with no sign of ending. But Anders nodded, and that was enough. The boy woke at midnight. His mother screamed, a sound that made everyone in the shelter jerk awake, and then the scream became crying, and then the crying became laughter, and the boy was sitting up on the warm stones looking confused about why his mother was crushing him against her chest. "He's warm," the mother kept saying. "He's warm. The floor's warm." "How is the floor warm?" Elsa explained again. "The steam vent, the channels, the principle of using the Earth's heat instead of fighting against the Earth's cold." She explained it to people who had called her a liar, who had refused to help her, who had bet money on when she would freeze to death. They listened now. Know how to bank a cabin, how to seal how to bank a cabin, how to seal a wall, how to cut enough wood to keep a stove burning through January. He looked around the shelter, at the frost on the walls, at the ice on the ceiling, at the impossible warmth rising from the floor. "I never knew this was possible." "The Tukudika knew," Elsa said. "They've been wintering near hot springs for generations. I just listened when they talked." "The Indians," Torsen's voice was flat. You learned this from Indians. I learned this from a sheep-eater elder who survived more winters than you've been alive. Elsa met his eyes. The same elder your government rounded up and sent to a reservation because this land was too valuable for people who actually knew how to live on it. Torsen said nothing. The storm continued for 2 more days. On the morning of November 16th, Elsa woke to silence. The wind had stopped. The ice fog had lifted. Through the gap around the door, she could see blue sky. She pushed open the door and stepped outside. The world was white and utterly still. Snow lay 3 feet deep in the ravine, drifted to 8 and 10 feet against the hillsides. The cold was still vicious. Her breath crystallized instantly, and her exposed skin began to ache within seconds. But the killing wind was gone, and the ice fog had retreated to wherever ice fog went when it finished killing things. She walked to the thermometer Ingrid had hung on a pine tree near the shelter. The mercury had risen enough to give a reading, 43 degrees below zero. 3 days ago, the temperature had been 22 above, a drop of 65 degrees, the fastest she had ever experienced, faster than anything the settlers of Gardner had ever seen, and she had survived it. Her siblings had survived it. The people who had called her a liar had survived it because they had come to her shelter, because they had pressed their frozen bodies against her warm floor, because she had chosen to help them even after everything they had done. Elsa stood in the snow and felt something she hadn't felt since her father died. Not happiness, the word was too simple. Something more complicated, a kind of quiet ferocity. She had been right. She had been right, and she'd proven it, and now everyone knew. Behind her, the door opened. Gustav Torsen stepped out, his fox fur coat wrapped tight against the cold. "We need to get back to town," he said. "See what's left. Help where we can." "I know." "When things settle." Torsen hesitated. "Built it. How it works. Whether it could build it. How it works. Whether it could be done elsewhere." "It could be done anywhere there's steam," Elsa said. "Near hot springs, near vents. The Yellowstone country has dozens of sites, hundreds, maybe." "You'll show them?" Elsa looked at the man who had told her she would freeze. The man who had predicted her death with the certainty of arithmetic. The man who was now asking for her help. "Yes," she said. "I'll show them." Torsen nodded once. "Then let's go see what's left of Gardner." What was left of Gardner was not much. The ice fog had killed 17 people in 3 days. 8 froze trying to reach neighbors when their own shelters failed. 3 died in the Crenshaw boarding house collapse. 2 cavalry soldiers were lost between Fort Yellowstone and Mammoth Hot Springs, a distance of 200 yards. 4 others died in circumstances no one could explain, found frozen in positions that suggested they had simply stopped and given up. Cattle losses were catastrophic. The ranches that had survived the Great Die-Up lost half their remaining herds in a single week. Horses froze in stables that should have been adequate. Chickens, pigs, milk cows, anything that couldn't find shelter from the wind died where it stood. The cold was worse than 1887, worse than anything in living memory, and Elsa Morenius had been the only person to predict it. The story spread fast. By Christmas, everyone in Park County had heard about the Norwegian orphan who built a steam-heated shelter while the town that shunned her burned and froze. By New Year, the story had reached Livingston and Bozeman. By spring, letters were arriving from settlers across Montana Territory, asking for details. Ingrid Halverson was the first to build a copy of Elsa's design. Her site was 2 miles north of Gardner, where a small hot spring bubbled up through the rocks. She hired a carpenter to help with the construction, proper walls, proper roof, proper door, and by October of 1888, She had a winter shelter that could maintain 55 degrees inside when the temperature outside dropped to 40 below. Henrik Lund built the second shelter near Cook City. A rancher named Patterson built the third at Chico Hot Springs. By the winter of 1889, 9 families in the Yellowstone country had built steam-heated structures of various designs, all based on the principle Elsa had discovered: let the earth warm you instead of fighting the earth's cold. Gustav Thorsen never built a steam shelter. He had enough money to buy coal and enough hired hands to cut firewood, and pride prevented him from adopting a technique invented by a 12-year-old girl he had once dismissed. But he stopped predicting that orphans would freeze, and when Elsa's name came up in conversation, which it did, often he said nothing at all, which, for Gustav Thorsen, was as close to an apology as anyone would ever receive. Elsa Marenius proved up on her father's claim in the spring of 1892, 5 years after his death, exactly as the Homestead Act required. She was 17 years old. Anders was 14 and already working as a carpenter's apprentice in Livingston. Marta was 11 and had not stopped speaking since the night she announced that someone was outside. Elsa never returned to the steam shelter. It had served its purpose, kept her alive through the worst cold in Montana history, but it was too far from the claim, too far from the land her father had died for. She sold the cabin her father had built to a family from Minnesota and used the money to construct a proper frame house with double walls and a coal stove and glass windows that didn't leak. She married a surveyor named Thomas Lindqvist in 1896. They had 4 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. She lived in Park County until her death in 1941 at the age of 66. She never saw Crowbird again. She kept his eagle feather in a box beside her bed until the day she died. On November 12, 1887, the temperature dropped 65 degrees in 3 days. At its coldest, the mercury fell to 43 below zero. Ice fog turned the air into white death that killed 17 people and more livestock than anyone bothered to count. Gustav Thorsen had stood in Elsa's yard 2 months earlier and delivered his verdict with the certainty of a man who knew Montana winters. "You'll freeze," he had said, "and they'll freeze with you. That's not a prediction. That's arithmetic." The arithmetic had been wrong. Elsa Marenius did not freeze. Her brother did not freeze. Her sister did not freeze. The floor she built from stones and steam held 70 degrees while the world outside dropped past 40 below. And when the people who had called her a liar came begging for warmth, she let them in. On the morning the cold finally broke, she stood in snow 3 feet deep and watched the sun rise over the Yellowstone Valley. The sky was the hard blue of a Montana winter, and her breath crystallized into tiny diamonds that hung in the still air. Behind her, through the open door of her shelter, she could hear her siblings stirring on the warm stones. The earth breathed beneath her feet. It had been breathing for 1,000 years, and it would breathe for 1,000 more. She had learned to listen. That was all.